Hey there, everybody. Thank you again for attending our low voltage lowdown. Today, Dave Harris and I are going to be talking about a question that comes up quite a bit, and that has to do with cheap Ethernet cable. Is it okay to use? And what is cheap? So first, I'm going to jump in and then Dave and I will alternate between talking points. We need to kind of separate what cheap is from inexpensive. When we mean cheap, I'd like to set a couple of ground rules as to what cheap is. And so when we say cheap, we mean Ethernet cable that does not meet the industry standards, that being ANSI TIA 568 2.D. That's a mouthful, but that standard is an industry standard and sets the performance and performance requirements for Ethernet cable and sets some boundaries on physical construction as well. It doesn't just tell you how to design an Ethernet cable specifically, but it does give you very extensive performance requirements. So basically, if it doesn't meet the industry standard for construction or performance, then we would call that cheap. Let's say you're buying a patch cord from wherever, from big box store, Amazon, wherever it might be, and it comes with bad terminations on the end. Then we would say that's cheap. Then that ties in with the next point, which is if the Ethernet cable receives poor or no quality testing at the factory it's made, then there's no guarantee that that quality will be the same from spool to spool or patch cable to patch cable. We would call that cheap. If you have cable that you have properly installed and it won't field certify, for example, on a DSX 8000, then we'd call that cheap too. But cheap isn't just about the actual product. Cheap also might include lack of proper documentation. For example, specification sheets. Specification sheets are really important to determine what kind of connection hardware will fit your cable. That's really critical if we're talking about 8P, 8C, or AKA RJ45 connectors, but it can even become important when talking about keystones and stuff like that. So lack of documentation is a real good sign that you got cheap cable on your hands. A lack of customer support, that nobody to call, nobody to write. I mean, you got questions and nobody's got answers. We'd call that pretty cheap too. Another one is not meeting regulatory safety standards, that being either UL or CETL-US, which is equivalent to UL, for voltage and flame resistance or toxic gas emanation if it's plenum cable and the cable happens to off gas. So all of those things, if it doesn't meet safety regulations, then that's definitely a cheap cable. Or, and just generally speaking, if a cable is specifically sold to you as suitable for a particular application like outdoors and it falls apart outside, then we'd call that a cheap cable too. So basically, they sold you something and it doesn't meet what you were looking for or looking to do. So that, I think, is what a cheap cable is. Dave is going to jump in on the next point.
I'm going to talk about what inexpensive means, at least what it means to us. And it doesn't have to do that much with the quality of the cable. It just has to do with the cost. And cable that costs more is not necessarily better. Sometimes cable that costs more is the worst choice, because a cable can be inexpensive and it can meet all of the ANSI TIA 568 2D standards. And these are standards that ensure the quality of construction of the cable and the quality of the performance of the cable. So if your cable meets these standards, you're not going to find us calling it cheap. Inexpensive, maybe. Also, a cable can be inexpensive and satisfy not just the standards, but satisfy the installation's particular requirements. For example, security cameras often don't need anything more than Category 5E cable to meet their performance needs. And Category 5E cable is less expensive, it's more flexible, it weighs less, and you can fit more cables into the same piece of conduit than you can higher categories. Is it cheap? Is it low quality? No, because it meets the standards.
Thank you very much, Dave. So yeah, cheap and inexpensive are not the same thing. So I'm going to cover some common misnomers that are out there, and hopefully this will help clear up some of the major differences between so-called cheaper and expensive. So a lot of information on the internet is not exactly correct. I mean, it may not be flatly wrong, but it's not exactly correct. And one of the biggest ones is that shielded cable is better or somehow higher quality than unshielded. That is absolutely, completely untrue. It is quite possible to have a shielded cable that does not meet what you're looking to do with it, and it costs more, where an unshielded cable is looking to do exactly what you want to do. It meets all of your performance requirements. It might be built better, and it costs less. So shielded cable is designed for certain types of installation environments. It doesn't mean that just automatically picking shielded cable is better, because shielded cable does not make your cable faster by default. So most installations don't even require shielded Ethernet cable. And in fact, if you improperly install shielded cable, you can actually cause yourself problems that you were actually looking to avoid, with additional interference, ground loops. I mean, you name it, and not to mention it's more difficult to install. It has a much larger bend radius. You can't turn it as tight. It's heavier, costs more to terminate. It's more difficult to terminate. So yeah, shielded cable has a place in the world, but you can't just flatly say that it's better, quote unquote. Another good one that we get is that people assume that plenum cable, that being cable that you use like in a commercial building in the air handling space, between, like above a drop ceiling or below a raised floor, is somehow better or higher quality than like the general cable jacket called CMG or CMR, which stands for riser. And again, this is another misnomer. It's not necessarily true. It really all, again, depends on the installation environment. And it's possible to spend a lot of money on plenum or CMP rated cable and get no benefit whatsoever from it. Plenum rated cable also can't be run outdoors. It's an indoor cable. I've never seen a plenum rated outdoor cable, not personally. So plenum rated cable should be used where you have to use it. Oftentimes your contract for like a commercial installation will specify that you have to use it. You'll see that like in institutions for hospitals, government buildings, things like that. But if you're using it in a non-plenum rated space, you really don't have any benefit from it. So just because you spent more money and the cable jacket happens to be more flame resistant doesn't mean that you got a better cable out of it. The third one that I'd like to cover, one of the biggest misnomers of all, is you have to somehow buy Cat 6A or higher in order to get high quality cable. Well, this is untrue most of the time. So we're going to add a couple of caveats to this one. You should purchase the category cable that meets your current LAN speed requirements. That's local area network, LAN, with an eye towards future proofing within reason. Cat 7 isn't even a TIA standard, and it is equally unreasonable as Cat 8 is. The reason being that Cat 8 is nothing more than Cat 6A. It's just that at short 98-foot distances, it can go faster. But after 98 feet, it's Cat 6A then. It'll do Cat 6A performance. But let's just talk about Cat 6A. So Cat 6A not only costs more, but it can be more challenging to install and terminate. It's thicker, beefier cable. The termination hardware is costlier. And for example, let's say you have a wired printer, and the printer, like most other wired printers, does not require a Ethernet speed connection more than 100 megabits a second. And considering that Cat 5e can achieve 25 times that speed at 2.5 gigabits per second, it would not make sense to upgrade or spend more money on that particular cable going to that particular printer. That said, if you foresee a printer that may require 10 gigabits per second in your future, well, okay, then Cat 6A is probably a good idea. But, backing off from all of that, with all that said, the standard, that being ANSI TIA, does recommend that Cat 6A gets used for all new construction, and we cannot disagree with this recommendation. The reason why is difficulty of installation. So considering that replacing Ethernet cable in your walls is not exactly easy, or might even be impossible, then simply going with Cat 6a from the start would make sense. One last thing, that somehow thinner Ethernet cable is low quality, or thin cable is low quality. Well, if you're doing an apples to apples or oranges to oranges comparison between two cables that are supposed to be identical and one's thicker and one's thinner, that could be true, okay? And it can be a quality indicator, but it's not necessarily the case. Cables are made with different gauge of conductors, and sometimes they lack certain features like a spline inside, depending on the category rating they're supposed to achieve. So thin Ethernet cable may not necessarily indicate low quality. Sometimes thicker cable contains things like water blocking tape. Well, that's meant for direct burial. But just because it happens to be thicker than the cable next to it that doesn't use water blocking tape doesn't make it somehow better than the thinner one. It just makes it different. So now that we've covered some misnomers, I think Dave can cover some overall truisms.
Thanks, Don. I've got a couple of facts to share about the individual conductors that are in Ethernet cable. And something to watch out for is something called copper-clad aluminum, usually abbreviated CCA. Copper-clad aluminum can still be found in conductors in the American marketplace. And this is disturbing because it is bad, cheap cable. Don't buy it. It'll cause performance loss for your data transmission. It will cause PoE voltage loss. It'll cause excess heat. And it's not recognized by any American standards body. And in some jurisdictions, it's flatly illegal to install it. So if you're tempted, and you shouldn't be, you better check with your inspector before you buy this stuff. And if you do buy a box of cable or reel of cable, and you lift it up and it weighs about a third of what you expect it to, be very afraid. It's probably mostly aluminum. Walk away. The second thing to talk about when it comes to individual conductors is stranded versus solid copper conductors. Both have their place. It's not a question of quality. It's a question of application. Solid copper cable is preferred for permanent installation in structured cabling. On the other hand, stranded cable or stranded conductors in cable is meant where flexibility is required, like in long portable rollout reels that get reeled back up and rolled back out, say on a daily basis or a periodic basis. Solid copper cable won't hold up to that working and reworking over time, but stranded conductors are built for it. You'll also find stranded conductors in patch cables for the same reason, flexibility. It's not a question of quality. Stranded cable is not higher or lower in quality than solid cable or solid conductors. It's just a difference in application.
I just wanted to add that, if someone out there decides they want to, play roulette and go grab some copper-clad aluminum cable and install it, we stand ready to help you get the right stuff when you decide that inevitably that you're going to need to replace it. This has happened over and over and over again. So we're ready to help you out. So anyway, that's pretty much our podcast this time around. Not terribly long, just covering the differences between what, so-called is cheap or inexpensive and all about application and what those terms mean and what they don't mean. And so please visit our Cable Academy at truecable.com. And we have close to 200 blogs, a lot of them with embedded videos to go looking at, and quite a bit of information out there. And we also just introduced our patch panels. So you might want to take a quick look at those. Those are pretty impressive pieces of kit that we just introduced. And there's a great deal of information that we're putting out about how to properly install and use them. So be sure to tune in for our next Q&A session, our next podcast. And with that, I'm going to say you have a great day and happy networking.